Hi, and welcome to the Team Deacons podcast. This podcast is a dialogue between Roger and James Deacons, joined by Matt Wyman, starting from a submitted question and ending who knows where. We're also joined by guests on occasion. We're connecting through Zoom, so bear that in mind when you hear the audio. If you'd like to submit a question, please do so by emailing pod@rogerdeacons.com. Today, we have a special guest with us. He really needs no introduction. We've had the pleasure of collaborating with him 4 times, and we hope to do it again in the future. His first feature, American Beauty, won him an Oscar. You might say, where do you go after that? Well, not only has he continued making great films, but they are all different. We've worked with him on Jarhead, Revolutionary Road, Skyfall, and 1917. All very different projects, but all films we're really proud of. We're very pleased to welcome our friend and collaborator, SamMendes. Sam, thank you for joining us.
It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see you, both your smiling, sun-kissed faces from the other side of the
planet. Exactly. So could you tell us how you got to where you are now? Did you always want to tell a story?
I think I got the theatre bug a little bit at school when I was about 16. I went to see some plays at Stratford with the Royal Shakespeare Company. And, then I ended up directing the school review. And then I went to university thinking maybe I might want to try acting. And I ended up directing my friends at the end of my first year in a play. And I had that moment that I suppose you hope for. And I've always felt lucky to have that one moment where I just thought, oh yeah, this is somehow I feel like this is what I'm supposed to do. I don't think I was very good at it to begin with, and I feel like I'm still learning. But I got the bug then, and I worked, for probably over from that day to when I directed my first movie was 15 years. So I spent 15 years telling stories in theatre, and then circumstances conspired for American Beauty, which still remains one of the great screenplays that I've ever read, to land on my desk shortly after directing a production on Broadway. And that, as you say, it sort of took off from there. But I wonder if you remember, you don't probably know this. I don't think we've ever had a conversation about the fact that the first person I offered or did availability for cinematographer on American Beauty was Roger Deakins.
No.
Absolutely.
No.
Yeah. And of course, at the time, I wouldn't have said that because Conrad would have felt, Conrad Hall, of course, who shot it, a great friend of yours and an extraordinary man. But Conrad, at that time, was considered, slow and cranky, and and it'd been a while since he'd done, his heyday. You could argue, at least until American Beauty, had been movies like, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and In Cold Blood, and Cool Hand Luke, and Tequila Sunrise, which is probably, I don't know, it was maybe 10 years earlier. He hadn't really done many movies, but this is the funny thing about directors and cinematographers, is you probably never know, when people availability you and you're not available, because I think at the time you were shooting a movie with the Coen brothers, your agent just says to the guy who's making an inquiry, no, he's not free at the moment, he's doing a movie. So you probably never knew that this small...
I never did. Film. That's the first time I've ever heard that.
Wow.
I never did. As I was building up to this interview, because obviously I've done a lot of prep, Roger, like...
Yes, I'm sure, yes.
I've been all day for this interview. And I thought, I wonder if I've ever told Roger that he...
No.
And it was because, I think, well, it's pretty obvious at the time, it was because of Fargo. There was a sort of Fargo... The Barton Fink, Fargo, Big Lebowski type run of Coen Brothers movies, which are kind of, speak for themselves, really. Just an amazing array. And I remember my friend Johnny Cake saying, who's an old friend, saying, if you do a movie, maybe you could get Roger Deakins. Like this,
wow.
This hallowed
wow.
figure.
Wow.
So, yeah. And then I offered it to other people too, because they told me not to offer it to Connie. So I offered it. The person I actually offered it to, who was available, was Fred Elms, who shot
Yeah.
Blue Velvet, and was a wonderful cinematographer, and he turned it down, and then very sweetly, after seeing the movie, when we finished it, wrote a very lovely card saying that was the biggest mistake of my life.
Wow.
There we are.
I wish I'd have known that. I could have wound Connie up about that.
That's probably why I didn't tell you.
Yes, probably better.
Can I ask, what were you looking for in a cinematographer? You'd never made a film. Had you ever made a film at all?
No.
If you no, not even with an 8mm camera or anything,
nothing,
right?
No, and if you've seen my films that I shoot on my iPhone, you'll probably be very pleased about that. I think you realise when I came to storyboard American Beauty, when I came to actually try and visualise the film, I realised that, over the 15, 20 years of watching movies, I had obviously at some point, probably my late 20s, thought I'd like to make a film. And so I'd been compiling, in a way, in my own head, kind of mental dossier of cinema style and cinematography. And when I came to actually storyboard it and ask cinematographers, I realized I had some very specific tastes that, had I not been forced to storyboard, I'm not sure I would have known quite so clearly. So, for example, at that time, I would have said to you, so you said, who are the filmmakers you admire? I would have probably put Scorsese near the top of the list, right? Goodfellas, like a lot of people, had an enormous impact on me. So did Taxi Driver. But I found that I knew I couldn't make a movie like Scorsese. My style, whatever it was for American Beauty, was not Scorsese's style. I wasn't going to go and chase, someone else's style. I realized as I read this script that I had a very specific, very composed, very balanced, painterly, symmetrical image in my head that was quite stylized, that felt like its own thing, And I felt like the cinematographers that I was looking for were people who could work in both a high style, so for example, Barton Fink or Lebowski, or in a very observational, very almost deadpan, uninflected way, which would be Fargo. I was very struck. I remember reading an interview with you at the time that you described Fargo as observational. And I remember thinking, what a great word, And you were talking about it as an objective film, whereas Barton Fink is a subjective film, Barton Fink, in a way, is like going into John Turturro's head. And a lot of the time, you're not sure whether what you're seeing is his reality or his imagination. Whereas Fargo is almost to a fault deadpan, that scene where they break into her house and kidnap her. She's sitting watching the telly, and this bloke walks up outside the window, and you can see her thinking, it's a bloke outside my window with a mask on, and bang, suddenly he's in the house. And it depends on that sort of almost excessive normality for its effect. You know what I mean? That there is a sort of poetry of the ordinary in that film, So I was very aware at that time, okay, who understands that's a style, and I must have been aware. I can't remember why, but I must have been very aware of the cinematographers. I must have known, and I knew the movies I liked, and obviously I started with you, and I probably went through. I remember meeting Adam Hollander. Do you remember Adam Hollander?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Who shot Midnight Cowboy, and he was spiky and opinionated and interesting, but I knew that we wouldn't. I could just feel the energy was wrong between us, and that's things you learn very quickly. And it was because, this is a long story, so forgive me, but you can edit it, James, so it's all right. I had done a play with Nicole Kidman called The Blue Room, which was on Broadway at the time, and I was off to make American Beauty, and I knew nothing about Hollywood. I'd never lived in LA, and she said very kindly, "Listen, you can live in our guest house, right? We have a house, and I'm not going to be there. I'm on Broadway." And at that point, she was married to Tom Cruise, and Tom was off doing, movies and what have you. And so I was basically there on my own in their guest house in Brentwood. And Tom came in for a couple of days and was, as always with Tom Cruise, incredibly friendly and incredibly helpful. And he said, "Who's going to shoot your movie?" And I said, "I don't know. I've offered it to, 4 or 5 people, and none of them are available, or they've turned me down." And he said, you should think about Conrad Hall. I've just produced a movie called Without Limits about Steve Prefontaine. It was written and directed by Bob Town, and Connie shot it. And it hasn't been released yet. Would you like to see it? And so he sat me down in his screening room and we watched Without Limits. And I thought it looked great because, hey, it was shot by Conrad Hall, but it was very... It had a sort of 70s feeling to it. It was all desaturated colors. It wasn't sort of sexed up. Do you know what I mean? There was no slow-mo. No sort of, it was quite, it was quite unfashionable at that time, that movie. It's a good movie, Billy Crudup.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, I mean, do you think you would do it? What's his... So Tom said, oh, he's a great guy. He's just the most delightful man. And so I met him and he came, he turned up in his sports car to the little office we had on Wilshire Boulevard. And he came in and he was, as you remember,
he was Connie.
He was Connie, and he was just the most unbelievably charming, mischievous, funny, delightful, charismatic, slightly mad. And he was just, we just hit it off. I mean, and he was just a wonderful human being, as you know, and that was an enormous stroke of luck for me because, in the absence of a you or a Fred Elms, the fact that Conrad was available and wanted to do it and was willing to work with a young filmmaker who really, at that stage in certain areas didn't know his arse from his elbow. I mean, I'd storyboarded a bunch of the movie, but I couldn't, I literally had to ask him. I said, at what point do I say action? I remember saying this like 2 days.
Oh, that's
before.
lovely.
And he said, okay, the sound will say rolling and, camera will say set. And then you say, so on that first day, I remember Connie really loudly saying set like this, like, hearing me. And then
that's your cue.
And I was so excited that I'd said action on the first day that I forgot to say cut. I was like,
oh, you still forget sometimes.
I do. Well, as you know, I'm no big fan of saying action anyway. I let other people say action. I still find it slightly embarrassing. I think I just like you're performing the role of a film director. Do you know what I mean? You like film directors say action and cut. I've always rather admired Clint for saying okay, go, and stop at the end. It's like it just seems so. It seems such a strange thing, but. Yeah, so that was all came about.
How interesting, because that film, Without Limits, I felt Conrad had gone back to earlier work he'd done, like Fat City or Tell 'em Willie Boy, Electric Glide in Blue, and it was that kind of slightly 70s, but it was more naturalistic, wasn't it? I mean, but what you were doing in American Beauty was much more stylized, like you say. It almost had a feeling of Barton Fink it
was more stylized
moments.
And I hadn't seen him really do that in the way that I'd seen you do that, and I was worried. I remember in pre-production that he wasn't going to get that. He was going to make it a little too long lensy. He was going to move the camera too much, and I wanted to really. And I remember having a small disagreement with him, really a small one, but I remember it being crucial because I remember him looking at me. We were tech scouting the location, which was 2 houses that are next door to each other, which we shot on the Warner Brothers Ranch, out in LA. And we were looking for a place to put the camera for an establishing shot, just, idly, with the crew were looking around, and as they do on a tech scout day. Yeah. And we were standing next to each other. And I said, I reckon here for the establishing shot. And he said, yeah, and a little push in. And I said, no push in. And he went, well, what do you mean? I said, no, I want it to be really formal, static. It's very, very few camera moves. And when they do, very slow. And there's no time in an establishing shot. I want it to be almost flat, like a painting. And I remember I could see him thinking, Jesus Christ, this guy's got an opinion about a freaking establishing shot. Already he's telling me I can't move, I don't want tracks. But I just knew that's what I wanted. And I remember that little conversation being quite important, because it was like I was very, very set on what the style was of the movie, and I think that as James said in a very lovely introduction, is that each movie we've made and the movies we've made together each one has had completely different rules that we've made them ourselves. We've all made them, sat down, okay, well these are the rules of this movie, but none of them are the same. But I had in my head my set of rules for American Beauty. And I think Conrad, what you get in American Beauty is a mixture of the stylization, the formal, symmetrical style I was talking about. And then you have this sort of more romantic, he did use longer lenses at times than I thought he was going to. The lighting has a softness to it. The things that I think he does brilliantly in the movie is when I think of the scene with the plastic bag blowing in the wind, weirdly, I don't ever think of the bag itself or the image on the TV set. What I think about is the two of them watching it and the light and the way it streaks in from the window and a big diagonal shadow falls across their faces in a way that's very Conrad. I didn't ask for that shadow, right? It's an uneven lighting image, but it's absolutely beautiful. And the light hits her hand. And as she reaches across to hold his hand, the light touches it. And it's a sort of, and the beauty of that scene is the lighting of the interior. So people talk about the image on the TV screen or the video, but I always say, no, but it's Conrad's lighting that's the magic in that scene. It's this sort of late afternoon, sort of Southern Californian glow that just sort of that was very him, I think. There was one day I remember him coming in, and I've told you the story, but I wanted to get another scene where I wanted to get light coming through the window, and he didn't have any space because we were in some terrible location. So he said, leave me with it for a few minutes. And I came back, and there it was, this light hitting the wall behind Kevin Spacey and Annette Bening. And I said, how have you done that? And he said, come have a look. This little twinkle. And he'd scrumpled up some orange plastic bags and shoved them behind the sofa and banged a light against it. And he had amazing, and it looked like, to all intents and purposes, it was coming through the window, but he had that sort of, that sort of inventive, slightly improvisatory quality. And I think because the movie wasn't a big movie, it wasn't a big star movie, there was no real studio pressure, he felt released again, almost like he was making movies when he was young. And I think that sort of re-infused him really with what he...
I mean, I really thought a lot of his best work was like that, like a Fat City or something, where he's got such a connection with what he's shooting. It is, like you say, you feel like he's a little boy, kind of just, enjoy. You can see the joy in it, can't you? What he's doing.
You can. I mean, my image I have of him always is sitting. I mean, he would light forever if you give him the chance. He would literally. He doesn't have that inbuilt. I mean, you have a sort of inbuilt clock, which is at a certain point you start feeling like most cinemas, a little bit guilty that you're taking up time.
Well, I was going to say,
you're quite puritanical about that sort of thing. So you're like, I don't want to. I mean, the worst thing about 1917 for you was the fact that you felt personally responsible for the sun being out.
That's so true.
You really, it's not your fault that we can't shoot today. Right? No one's blaming you.
How many times you said that? I still couldn't get it in my head. Yeah.
But he didn't have any of that. He would have been like, he would have sat there with his eye on the eyepiece, and he used to sit there talking to Tom Stern, and he would move a light an inch to the right, move it back an inch to the left, bring in a flag, move the flag, move in another flag, and he would sit there humming to himself as these people sort of beeping around, and he was never happier than he was just sitting there, humming like a little kid with a toy camera, And I remember having a similar moment with you, actually, funnily enough, and James is part of this story too. So we were up on the roof of the Grand Bazaar in Istanbul, as you are, obviously. You want to pop up onto the roof of the Grand Bazaar, from which you could see about 5 mosques, and they were calling the faithful to prayer, and the sun was going down over the Bosphorus. Obviously, we were scouting for Skyfall. We were, I think, either tech scouting, or maybe it was the first time we'd ever been there. And I saw what I thought was a good photograph for me to take, which was you. You were standing right on the edge of the Grand Bazaar, the roof of the Grand Bazaar, looking out, and it was an incredible sunset. And I took a photo, and I texted it to James, and I said something like, "Just thought you should know what your husband's up to right now." And she texted back, "Yeah, that's Roger. Give him a camera and something to point it at, and he's happy." And I just thought that was just because that's where you and Connie, who are, as personalities, But there are similarities, but there are big differences too. But in that respect, there's a sort of the peace that kind of descends on you when you're actually in that. You're looking for images and you're finding images and you're sort of really beginning to imagine the movie. That's you're both very similar in that regard.
Yeah. I'm interested going back to what you're saying about the establishing shot on American Beauty and having that discussion. It's interesting that sometimes I've found this with a number of people, that you have a discussion about some small, insignificant thing and actually informs the whole movie in some way,
Yeah.
Because I'm sure that he suddenly realized what you were talking about just through that one little illustration.
Yeah, I think he did, and the shot is exactly as planned. Is in the movie. I mean, and I remember also there was another little moment on set very early on. We were shooting Kevin Spacey looking out of a window at Annette Bening cutting roses in the front garden, and he was slightly off center. And I said, no, I want it absolutely flat on, like a frame within a frame, symmetrical, almost like a proscenium. And he got that too. And those were the two conversations about the style of it. And once he was into it, he loved it because it felt consistent, I think, to him. And, we also, I talked a lot about early on that for me, that movie was about, the risk of sounding a bit pretentious, but it was about entrapment. At the beginning, they were all in prison, really. They're little prisons of their own making. Spacey's in his little prison of a bedroom and his prison of a car and then his prison of a little cubicle at work. And that's the first prison. The first prison is being trapped behind that glass window looking out. And the movie is a process of breaking out of that entrapment and breaking free, which he does. And so all the images of him outside running and all that come in the latter part of the film. And early on, he's very static. When he's moving, he's being carried, he's in the back seat of the car asleep. He doesn't even get the front seat. His daughter gets the front seat, so he's almost like he's been infantilized at the beginning of the film. And he has no self-respect, and his kids and his wife don't respect him either. And that was sort of tied into the visual style of the movie. So it wasn't just I saw it like that, but I felt it meant something. I felt it meant, and we talked about the same thing with Road to Perdition. That the movie starts in a frozen state because they are frozen as characters. Hanks is frozen in this position where he's a hitman. He kills people for a living, but he can't communicate that with his kids. His kids are growing older and want to know what he does for a living, but he can't say. And he as a character is locked. And the movie gradually thaws. So it ends in the warmth of the shore of Lake Michigan and the sun for the first time and green and sand and water and lapping waves. But it starts in the frozen, midwinter in Chicago, and all the colors or all the palette of the movie, the ice greens and the whites and grays, thaw. Although I remember Conrad vividly, just the relief after shooting in brutal conditions in Chicago, minus 30 for Road to Perdition, right through the winter of whatever it was, year 2000, 2001. And we got finally to Lake Michigan, and there was this beautiful beach and these gorgeous trees. And everyone was like, thank God we made it through the winter. And Conrad went, ugh, green! he hated green. He was like, ugh, like leaves. He would have been nowhere from 1917. I don't know. Yeah, so it was quite sentimental about that.
The thing I remember so much about American Beauty is the cutting. It was so modern to me, so different. I loved it. I guess it threw away some of the old rules that weren't necessary and sort of got to the point. Did that come from the style that you had shot, or had you been thinking about the cutting?
Well, partly, yes, James. I mean, there were a lot of very, very slow push-ins in the movie. They're very, very sort of stealthy, almost that and I was very determined. I mean, again, I had these opinions early to not have any Steadicam in that particular movie. I wanted the frame to be rigid and tension in the frame the whole time. It was a sort of Kubrickian influence, I suppose. Pressure always at the top of the frame, light sources bearing down on characters. I think of The Office at the beginning of the movie. And I remember the first dinner between the three family. It's a push in on a three shot really, and they're sitting around a table, and it's a one take scene. I mean, I don't use any coverage, and that's because I didn't shoot any coverage because I was so absolutely confident that I wasn't going to need it. This is how I was going to play the scene. Now, it's fair to say it took me 20 years to get back to that level of confidence on 97 to know I'm not going to take coverage here. But as you get older, you realize the ways in which you can fail, and you see the ways in which you perhaps regret not taking a close up here or close up there. And the funny thing about that scene in American Beauty is that was the day that Steven Spielberg who was running DreamWorks, who made the movie, chose to come. And so Steven watched what he thought was the master shot, and I did a slow push in. I probably did about 12 takes, got the take I liked, and I said, right, we're moving on. And he was like, you're not going to shoot coverage? And I went, no, I think I'm just going to use it like this. This is how I want the scene to be played. And he looked delighted. He just looked like, wow, I wish I had those balls. That's what it's like when you start out. You think that you're so certain about it. But the funny thing is, it's true that as time goes on, you begin to doubt those things, and I'll just cover myself. I'll just do this and I'll do that. But the cutting in American Beauty was very deliberate, and I was very determined not to overcut, and not to. I do a bit of double cutting, which I've never done before or since, which is, when he has a little fantasy with Mina Suvari. She's opened the fridge and they're flirting and everything, and she reaches and touches his shoulder, and I cut the movement of the hand 3 times, the same movement. It wasn't until I was trying to extend an explosion in Skyfall that I double cut it, because you're literally it was only the other day that I was showing Joe, my son, The Graduate. Never seen The Graduate, and I realized that he does it in The Graduate. That Mike Nichols and Sam Osteen do it in The Graduate, and I must have been influenced by that, because I'm sure The Graduate was a movie I would have watched around that time. I mean, or rewatched.
All the Wild Bunch, Sam.
Yes,
lots of double cutting in the Wild Bunch.
He does it to excess, doesn't he? Old
yeah. But, you can't miss it.
No, you can't. I was actually watching Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid the other day, and which starts, if you remember, with them blowing the heads off of live chickens.
Yeah.
Over again.
Nice little gentle
in slow
opening.
motion.
Yeah. You say about coverage and doing more, but for the people I've worked with, you and the Coen brothers, and Denis, most actually directors I work with don't do much coverage. I would never say you do a lot of coverage. Maybe we did more coverage on Skyfall, but I don't think we have. Otherwise,
we don't. I definitely don't feel we ever do the sort of just go around in a circle, 18 setups, all that stuff. No, I think that, but I think that's also because of you, Roger. I think that when we work together, the process of doing storyboards together is so clear that once you've come out of that, with your boards or with your shot list or whatever it is that we've decided we're going to do. Because even when we didn't storyboard, like Jarhead, for example, we did talk about the scenes a lot, and made the decision about how we're going to do. I think the things, the direction you're going to go in, and what you're not going to use. I suppose what happened on Jarhead was the advent, for me anyway, the advent of a second camera. Which, and again, we never used a second camera on Revolutionary Road, and we didn't obviously use one on 1917, but we used second cameras on Skyfall. On Jarhead, it worked really well because we were in a state of flux the whole time. It was all handheld. There was almost always a really interesting position for a second camera if we were going to use it. And you didn't get stuck with that thing that happened with second camera, which happened a little bit on Jarhead, where you start subtly compromising your A camera to fit in your B camera. And instead of having one 100% good shot and a 50% good shot, you have two 85% good shots, but no shot that carries the whole scene. And then and you start thinking, hang on a minute, I don't want to move the A camera another foot to fit the B camera in. Tell the B camera to fuck off. Let's get the A camera right, finish the
Yeah.
A camera, and then if there's another position, find what's the correct position, the best position for the second shot in the sequence, rather than the B camera. So, but in a way, I think that what it does is when you become aware you've got two cameras or you've got options, you don't quite focus on the A camera in quite the same way.
Right.
In your sort of master, point of view. And of course, 1917 is the absolute opposite of that, because there were no other cameras, there was no other shot, and so everything had to be contained within one. And I think that's probably, if we're honest, that's where we both feel happiest.
Yeah,
with an economy of means. I'm not saying everything scene has to be one shot or anything, but when you think of the scenes you're most fond of or sequences, they aren't that complex in terms of numbers of seconds.
Right.
They're bold, you know what I mean? But they're built around, pretty solid single shots. And I think that's just a way of thinking about it. But yeah, I don't think I'm a sort of coverage merchant, really.
No, I think Jarhead, really, it was two cameras, but there were certain scenes we didn't use two cameras, like when the Highway of Death and the aftermath, where Jake's sitting in that big bowl and being sick. And certain things we definitely shot single camera. Most of the double camera I was really glad, particularly we used two cameras when we were doing Under the Oil fires.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Well, I remember all that oil.
Well, we had to
and we were all dressed up in these bags.
We were basically being sprayed with molasses. I mean, it was
unbelievable, wasn't it?
We were being drowned in syrup. It was that. Yeah. But it tasted quite good, but it wasn't much fun to have to walk through. But the interesting thing is that something else happened on Jarhead, which is that you were operating a camera, and sparing your blushes, you're a brilliant operator, and your instinct about what the actor's going to do is second to none. So second camera was also working in tandem with you, and you became a sort of intuitive team. So it wasn't like you were sitting at a monitor screen watching, or even you weren't even on the wheels very much. You were basically had the camera on your shoulder.
No, it was all handheld, wasn't it?
It was. So, and I felt that the Highway of Death was amazing because, in fact, in some ways, not a million miles away from 1917, because it was a single snaking point of view, often going in and out of these, carcasses of cars and seeing these charred remains of people who had been caught in that horrendous sort of firestorm. And we didn't give them too many clues as to where to go or how to look or where to turn. We were trying to capture it the first time they saw it. It was pretty exciting, I thought.
Given we talked about earlier coming from theater and not having directed anything prior and not having the luxury of maybe like a film student having done 10 shorts, how did you educate yourself and come to a point of confidence for that first film where it sounded like you had a lot of theory behind it and you understood what shots meant or how certain things acted? Like, how did you get ready for that first film and making the jump from theater to cinema?
I think that it's a very good question, but I think that there's one very simple thing you find out about yourself very quickly, and that is, do you think in sequential images? Can you cut a scene together in your head? Do you understand what crossing the line is? Do you understand eye lines and how things fit together to form this domino effect, this chain that is a movie? Because one good shot, is not enough. It all has to fit together, and that's something that you don't know until you try it. And I think that the movies are littered with people who were brilliant in one regard, and theatre directors, but didn't quite have that other muscle. So I felt that when I started, I felt pretty confident that I was able to do that. But the other thing I decided this very early on in theatre too, is if I didn't understand something, I was going to ask. And there's no shame in that. I was never going to pretend to understand something that I didn't understand, And so that, for example, me asking Conrad, when do I say action, is a good example. But I did that in lots of small ways, Well, what's the quality of a 50mm lens compared to, where's the focal depth? And if you're any good at anything, it's a delight for someone to ask you how something works, because if you you're a cinematographer, you love that stuff. You want to talk about it. You're not asking how the camera works. You're asking about the quality of an image and what it communicates to you, to them, to the audience. I once said that to Connie, and Connie said, "Oh, Jesus, I don't know how a fucking camera works. That's someone else's problem. If it breaks, I just say the camera's broken, and I walk away and have a cup of coffee." And I was really, Connie, in a way, Connie's sort of anarchic spirit was helpful to me at that point, because he would say things like, "You don't need to know that shit. Just think about what's the movie in your head. Why. So I did a lot of asking, and I suppose that the movie I asked most about probably was Skyfall, because there was a lot of new stuff that I had to learn really while I was doing it. So I and some of it turned out is no different from making a normal. In fact, most of it is no different from making a normal movie. But there's a kind of myth around action sequences, or and it's like it's a car chase. It's just like a normal scene. It's just you need the geography. You need to know which direction they're going in. You need to follow the characters through it. You need to feel invested. You need a stake in it. You need to know who's got what, where they're going, and then it starts to work. It doesn't work because you got 17 cameras up and you're shooting on a 100mm lens, and there's lots of jiggery pokery.
Well, actually, I want to interrupt there, because talking about that, it's also choice of perspective, isn't it?
Yes.
And I remember on that film how much pushback there was when you decided to play that one fight in the glass tower in this one shot that pushed in on a profile.
Yeah.
And then ended up looking down the tower as Daniel fell down.
I know.
Now, I thought that was an amazingly gutsy thing, because, again, you talk about shooting coverage, but no, I'm not shooting coverage.
Yeah.
That's the shot,
Yeah.
And I thought that was quite superb. And it wasn't the only one, because you did the same thing going into the casino with the fight above the Komodo dragons.
Yeah. It's true. I mean, but I felt that we needed variety in the way that things were shot, and I felt like, and it's interesting because people remember that fight in the office tower because it's a one shot.
Right.
They don't talk about the fist fight in the whatever. When you cover the fuck out of it. I mean, I did a fight in a train in Spectre, absolute old school. Every punch, every shifting eye lines, everything was covered. It took us a week. No one gave a shit about it. It was a good fight, I mean, it's a good fight. You feel every punch landing, but it's somehow unmemorable. And I think it's so interesting, isn't it? What lodges itself in your kind of collective memory. But I did, and as you well know, we both struggled with second unit and with the editorial, sort of prevailing editorial style. There's nothing against our terrific second unit director, Alex Witt, but the truth is it wasn't us. And I think that was a shock for both of us. We're like, well, and it doesn't matter how much you explain it and how much you describe it and draw it and pre-plan it and walk it, and it only has to be 1 inch off, and it's not the shot you imagined. And it's really difficult to communicate that. And I found that again on Spectre. It's literally they're doing what they think you want.
Or what should be done in a stunt sequence, because that's the way it's done.
Well, that's the other problem, is that there's a lot of, this is how we do it, and so I was pushing against that a little bit. But most people, I mean, I think that I'm sure there were a bunch of people who thought, I was a sort of jumped up arty person from the theatre. What business did I have directing a Bond movie? And then I brought in another bunch of jumped up arty people like Roger Deakins.
I'm really arty.
And they were like, what's going on? And then they saw the video like, oh, right. So you weren't setting out to destroy the entire franchise. But
there is that pushback, isn't there? When you try and do, especially as James said, there's a certain way of doing action and shooting certain films. And we had this on Blade Runner, the idea that you're going to shoot it with a single camera is like anathema.
And also,
how can you do that?
You don't know how to do that sequence.
They just don't believe you. I mean,
because it's an action sequence.
I mean, one of the first experiences in my life was shooting 1984, and I operate, right? That was like, you can't do that. the pushback was like incredible.
I know, but it's funny though that I think one of the people has helped in this sort of not battle exactly, but kind of crusade to keep it as a single camera is Chris Nolan. And the reason that he's done a fantastic, I mean, it's astonishing to me that all those movies, Inception, Dark Knight, whatever, were shot on single cameras with no second unit. I mean, he's got multiple cameras for big stunts, obviously, but fundamentally they're single camera shoots and they're single unit shoots. But that's partly because he's a rare person who obviously doesn't like the second camera. I mean, which I think we would probably, with exceptions like Jarhead, and certainly most directors I know who have to use second unit don't like it. They do it because there is no other way around it. And there's so much coverage for a particular sequence, it would take you weeks and you need to get on to the next location. But, Chris he's clearly on set, extremely decisive, and there are no monitor screens and there's no people looking over his shoulder. And he looks at his little monitor and he says, right, we're moving on. And he goes, he moves quickly. And that kind of decisive, auteur-ish style applied to a large-scale movie can work. And that helped. That helped on Skyfall. It helped that sense that, there was that moment in the sort of mid-2000s when the B movie started to become the A movie. So your B movies, your Batmans and your Bournes and X-Men's and suddenly A-list directors were beginning to do them. And I felt when I saw Dark Knight that it was the best expression of post 9/11 angst and the worries that were affecting all of us about terrorism at that time that there was. And it was nothing to do with on the surface, it wasn't about 9/11. There's a marvelous speech that Michael Caine delivers about some people just want to see the world burn, I think he says, where everyone in the theatre was thinking, this is what it's like post 9/11. And a little light bulb went off in my mind. I thought, my God, these can be serious movies. And at the same time, wildly entertaining, thrilling, terrifying, scary, use all the bells and whistles of big movies. So when eventually Bond came around as an offer, I thought maybe one could do the same thing here. Maybe one could try to make a story about, which doesn't take Bond as the given. Bond was always I always say that, around about Moonraker, Bond movies start becoming kind of travelogues.
Right.
Where haven't we been? Well, let's do Venice. Let's do, a bit of cable car. Right? Yeah, that would be great. Now, story. How do we do this? Oh yeah, I defy you to answer what the fucking story is in Moonraker because I don't know. But it looked amazing, and it went to all these incredible glamorous places and it was vastly expensive. But Bond became the constant in those movies. He was the unchanging presence. It was everything else that changed around him. And with Skyfall and with Daniel as an actor, one was able to begin to use a Bond who actually changed and was a human being. And so our starting point was, well, he's getting older and he's badly injured and he comes back to England, find everything's changed and everyone's telling him he's old, he should stop and retire, and he's past it. And he's vulnerable, And during the course of the movie, we rebuild him and we add in the new M, the new Q, the new Moneypenny, and by the end, he is Bond again. And that felt like such a rich idea. And of course, obviously, it all pivoted around the death of Judi Dench of M, who, and in Judy and Rafe, and we had all these great actors, So I felt like, wow, you could really make a proper movie. And I remember coming to try and persuade you to do it, coming to Santa Monica and
walking on the beach,
walking on the beach, and you said, so how do we do it without it being corny or silly or any of those things? And I said, I think we have to imagine he's not called James Bond and make a great movie about that man. And if you take any previous knowledge about the character away, that movie still stands up. It doesn't require any knowledge. It does riff on certain things from the past, but if you look at it with no knowledge of previous Bond movies, there's a young man who comes in, helps him with his gadgets. There's a young woman who goes out in the field and then ends up being the secretary to the new M. There's a woman who clearly has a long relationship with who dies in his arms. And time passes in a way that it never had in a Bond movie. You acknowledge the passing of time. You acknowledge the death of a central character. and that person is going to get replaced. And suddenly time was real in a franchise which it had stood still for 40 years. And that felt like something new. Now I tried to get that back on Spectre and failed. I couldn't find a way. I did have an idea, thought it was good, but it fell apart. And then I was left with no third act. And I had to start shooting a movie.
Oh, dear.
A finished script, and I've never done that before.
That's
and
awful.
I will never do it again.
Yeah.
But it's hard once you get in that situation.
Yeah.
You're up against it with a delivery date. Then that's what happens with these big movies. Sometimes it's no one's fault. Release dates are release dates, but that's how it worked out on that one.
Is that the only movie you've ever done that wasn't completely written beforehand?
Yes. Yes. I mean, I think that it's fair to say that the best movies I feel I've made have come from the most complete scripts. So for me, that would be American Beauty, Skyfall, and 1917. To me, when I went in, I felt like I am rock solid about this. I don't care whether they like it or they don't like it. I don't have any real. We had a couple of question marks in Skyfall. It was vast, it was big, but fundamentally, I felt the story was so strong, and the rhythm of the whole for all three of those movies. And I really knew also, and I think in a way this is probably the most important thing, that the last 20 minutes of each of those movies really delivered. I felt like I know we have our strongest stuff at the end. I know where we're headed is really exciting. And every scene was tilted towards that. Where it's been more complicated is where the scripts are more fluid. Jarhead was a much more impressionistic film. It's much.
I love Jarhead, though.
Yeah,
I love it.
We are big fans of our own movie. Really.
Whoops.
Really uncoolly. I felt there was a tonal issue with Jarhead. Jarhead became something almost existential as a movie. A movie about a man who goes to war and never shoots his gun. But there were tonal things in it that I never felt that we shot, some of which were really good. There was a black comedy streak. There was a streak of fantasies that Swaff had that we cut from the movie. There was a much longer, much more politically motivated voiceover, which kind of got a little bit more airbrushed. Mm-hmm. It was a tricky movie to guide through the studio system, because despite the fact that Universal at that time under Stacey Snider was a great place to work, it was a $60 million art house film,
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and they needed to get the people who want to see a big war movie into the cinema. But the truth is, the whole movie was about defying the cliches of a war movie, not giving the audience the kind of catharsis that they require from a war movie. And he has a scene in it in which they're watching Apocalypse Now. It's a very meta movie. It's a movie about war and what other movies make the people who go to war think about war, or think war is going to be. And by inference, it's also about, what if a person who has no natural aptitude for the military ends up in the military, i.e. me, or somebody like a college boy, really, who doesn't, it's a great line at the beginning, what the fuck are you even doing here, that Joel Sargent says, and he says, I got lost on the way to college. Yes. A great line. But that's basically me, So I just felt like I never could quite get all of those things into it. I wanted it to be more political, and I think at the time we were a victim of, I think there were two movies that we made that were badly timed, not in and of themselves, but because of the world into which they were released. Jarhead was released at a moment when they had just printed a photograph in the New York Times of the 1,000th soldier to die in Iraq. And so to make a movie at that time about a war in which nobody died seemed irrelevant if you read it as a political statement. But the movie actually was saying, look, we started this relationship with the Middle East in this war. We thought it was a success, but we never got out. And the last line of the movie is, we're still in the desert. We never got out, and now we're fucked. So meddle with another country at your own peril. And there is a political message in there, but it was muted. And even right at the end of the movie, the last shot of the movie, if you remember, he's in his study, Swaff, and he's watching TV, and on the TV was George Bush. And the camera swung around, looked out of the window with him, and then what he sees out of the window, this is in the movie, becomes the desert. And there's he and his friends emerging out of the mirage. And it's a really nice last shot. But the studio wanted me for it not to be George Bush on the screen. And I took it out. And if I'm honest, I regret that, because now I feel like it sort of defanged the end of the movie. It's like, now I'm a civilian. Now I'm through it. But we look at that man on the television. He's still sending people out in the same place. But now it's not going so well. That whole thing was sort of removed. So that was a tricky thing for me. And the thing about Revolutionary Road for me was I'd always sort of sworn I would never do a movie of a great novel. And I just felt like I was reaching for this book that was a great novel for all the reasons. I mean, a great novel is a great novel for all the reasons that a great movie can't achieve. In other words, how could I put it? What is best about Revolutionary Road is the length of time it takes to paint someone's inner landscape. And that cannot be rendered in dialogue. And it's really, really hard. I mean, the old adage, bad books make good movies, The last part, and good books make bad movies, And that's, I found I really struggled with that. And then we made I think, retrospectively, we can say this now, an error. Well, I made an error, which is I chose to shoot too much of it on location. And we were stuck in that bloody house.
Oh my gosh.
And it was like we all just wanted to kill each other. And it was just too small. I mean, we just couldn't fit in there, and it took too long. I remember that dinner scene, where you have to move around the table, and it was like microsurgery. And if we'd shot it in a controlled environment where we could have removed the walls, or just a bigger house, it would have been we'd done it in half the time. And the problem with that is when you are taking that length of time to capture performance in a performance-based movie, the performances are so difficult to keep fresh. You're in 90-degree heat. You've been shooting this dinner party scene for 3 days. It kills the scene. It's very, very hard. And so there was something a little bit, I couldn't raise the flower, there was a slight deadness about the environment in which we shot it. Weirdly, the reason we shot it like that was to be able to go in and out of doors. We wanted to be able to get in and out of the back garden when we went to dusk. And actually, that is the best section of the movie. To me, the last 20, 25 minutes really works. But the other stuff, the set didn't give us enough, and we should have just cut our losses and built it and shot the inside-outside stuff on a location and just split the two, which strangely I did a lot on American Beauty, but I found myself not having the confidence to do it, 5-10 years later.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting the sort of differences between how you feel about directing theatre and then films, especially in context of Revolutionary Road.
Yeah.
And you're saying about performance and continuity of performance. In a film, obviously, you're stopping and shooting bits. Can you talk about that? And then obviously that leads to 1917, where you're basically doing a stage play in many ways, because it's one long piece.
It's a very good segue from Revolutionary Road, which was a movie I found very frustrating because I couldn't do what I do in theatre and let the performances flow and grow. It was very, the frustration for movies, if you're from the theatre or even if you're not, is that it's very fragmented and the process is very fragmented. And if you want to capture nuance, you need to cover every single performance because you never know when it's going to come or when you're going to need it in the cut. You can't just put it on a circular track around the dining table and just keep the camera moving. And I mean, there are some scenes that work beautifully like that. I remember there's a scene in Hannah and Her Sisters, which Woody Allen shoots on a circular track, and it's absolutely gorgeous. But that scene is about detecting and feeling the energy of the family. And when you're doing something that's a sort of microsurgery of Revolutionary Road, when it's like a sort of war that's being waged, and every eye twitch, every missed beat is a shift of power across the table, then you have to cover the scene, and then you break it up, and then you lose fluidity and you lose naturalness, and you're trying to remind people what they did when it, half a day ago or a day ago when they were doing someone else's coverage. No, can I just play you back there? Oh, and I found that really tricky on that movie. And I think what I realize is that I think you have to adapt your working style, and you have to adapt the style of the movie sometimes when you have a scene that, look, every director worth their salt has had the same problem, which is covering scenes around a table. There's a famous story, apocryphal probably, about Billy Wilder turning up to Hollywood as a young, and his hero was Lubitsch, and he worked and worked trying to get closer to him, and eventually he was asked to make tea on the Lubitsch set, but he had never seen him, and eventually someone said to him, "Hey, kid, go and the boss wants a cup of coffee, take him a cup of coffee." And he walked onto the set holding Lubitsch's coffee, and Lubitsch was sat slumped at a table, and all the crew had gone, and he was going, "Okay, I'll be over the right shoulder here, left shoulder there, right shoulder." And he was going around, and he was trying to work out the 19 setups to shoot the fucking dining scene,
Yeah.
And Wilder thought that's what directing is. You've got to go down and roll up your sleeves and work out every single. But the problem is that you then have to motivate, and you have to energize the actors. I mean, there was a very particular wonderful performance in Revolutionary Road from Michael Shannon. But Michael Shannon, this never happened to me before in any movie. He came in and his audition was drop dead perfect. I mean, he put it on film, and he was so good. All I could say to him was, "Listen, I don't do anything between now and when you have to shoot this."
Yeah, right.
Because it was this big scene, and he absolutely hit it out of the park. He did things I hadn't imagined possible in the scene. He just did it reading with a casting director. And I watched him over the course of 2 months overthink it, read it, ask questions about it, doubt it, And when it came to do it, it took me half a day to just ease him back up to what he had done for me instinctively out of the gate. Now, I felt I got it. He's nominated for an Academy Award. In a sense, it put him on a map as an actor. And it's a wonderful performance. He's a wonderful actor. And he's only human. He knew it was a big scene for him. And he's in a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet and, Kathy Bates and all these others. He wanted to deliver. And he was nervous. And that's what happens, and the juggling of different energies on a movie set is so much more difficult than on a theatre set. In a theatre, there's a collective energy and everyone's sort of riding the wave. And sometimes some people are slower than others, but basically everyone knows they have to get to the same point at the same time. The problem is on a movie set, the gas is like 2 for one person, 8 for another. This person's saving themselves for their coverage. That person over there is bored. That person's trying too hard. That person wants to be sitting with their headphones on, getting into the mood. That person wants to be joking and being on a cell phone. And that's really hard. Then we get to a 1917 type situation where we've got the boys exactly where we want them pretty much consistently, our 2 boys, Dean and George. But then you've got these day players, these very posh day players are coming in. You've got Colin Firth, Cumberbatch, and Andrew Scott, and they're all at different levels, and they're trying to seek out, okay, where is the movie? Do you want, you've got Colin Firth saying, do you want me to be a bastard general, or do you want me to be a rational general? Where do I pitch this? Am I an arsehole, or am I someone? I would pretty consistently said, you're just struggling. You're all in the fog of war. You're just struggling to do a good job. Think the best of your character and the worst of the situation. Don't judge the character, and certainly don't act on top of it. And so that involved me pulling down Benedict Cumberbatch, pushing Andrew Scott a little higher, a little quicker, a little sharper, a little more sarcastic for Andrew, a little less rhetoric and a little less boomy for Benedict. All those sorts of things. But that's easy because it's just one person on one day trying to get him down to the level or up to the level that the movie is at that point. When you've got a room full of them and they're all going off in different directions like a box of fireworks, that starts getting more complicated. And that happened a fair amount. It even happened a bit on Jarhead. I mean, do you remember there was a day when Jake knocked out his own tooth with a rifle butt?
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? He was so fucking into the scene.
Yeah, into it. Yeah.
Improvising away, and he practically killed poor old Brian.
Yeah.
Like, you know, shoved the rifle right in his cheek, and you know, they practically came to blows, and so it does happen because people at different levels. I remember Kevin Spacey on the set for American Beauty laughing and joking, you know, right up to action and even beyond, and then turning it on, and that's how he likes it to be. He wants to be relaxed. He doesn't want to think too much about it. He just wants to go.
Yeah.
And the other corner, you know, you got George Foreman and Ali. You've got the one who's talking and chatting, and you know, and just, and then you've got the silent one, which is Chris Cooper in that movie, who just sits there staring into the void, and you have to be together in the same scene. It's hard.
Yeah.
Daniel Craig and Javier Bardem were like that in Skyfall. You know. You know, you've got Daniel who's, you know, moody and, you know, winding himself up and building up to something, and then you've got Javier who's sort of skipping across the surface more with that role. So that's the job of directing a movie, isn't it? I mean, you've got to get him in the same film.
yeah. But then obviously on film you have the camera. You've got the ability to emphasize a performance or a moment that you can't in theatre. In theatre, an audience has got the one perspective, but in film, you can give them multiple perspectives.
Oh no, I mean, film is ultimately much more sophisticated in the number of things it can communicate, and it's also much more controllable. I mean, you can tell an audience to look at someone's fingernail if you want to, and you know, an entire scene. I mean, I often think of one scene. Actually, there's a marvelous. I'll tell you who I think has been certainly an underrated director, is James Ivory. Who I think James Ivory had a rough ride from the press, because Merchant Ivory became sort of byword for sort of pretty, you know, silly, pretty films and everyone in period costumes. But actually, Remains of the Day, for example, I think is a really great film. And there's a shot in Remains of the Day that I think of a lot. Anthony Hopkins is the butler, is serving dinner, and they're all talking, and he's completely contained and just serving. And if you remember, the story is about a butler who ultimately ends up serving a man who was a British fascist, who was a follower of Oswald Mosley and a Nazi. But in his job, it's not his job to listen or to judge, but simply to serve. And in a way, the movie becomes a metaphor for those people who find themselves caught up in fascism, but say, it was nothing to do with me. I was just doing my job. You know, so it becomes a metaphor for all the people who stood and watched while the Holocaust happened. And so it's a very profound film in a way. You got this scene, and it's a pullback. It starts on Tony Hopkins, and you hear the chatter of the dining table. There's probably 20 people around the time, and it just slowly pulls back and watches him. He's going around, he's serving them all. You hear the chatter, and he's just contained. He's looking down, he's serving them, and you pull back, you reveal the whole room and the windows and everything, and all those people and that tiny man, and you never take your eyes off him. You never take your eyes off. You pull back, you watch him go around that table. Even though there's all the other people talking, he doesn't say a word. He doesn't even look up. He's just doing his job. You can't do that in the theatre. You can't say, just look at the butler. Just watch the fucking butler, because that's the story. In the theatre, they're listening to the scene. And they're not going to look at the butler because the butler doesn't say anything. They're looking up. And unless you're going to stick a follow spot on the butler and let everyone else go into darkness. And that is an amazing difference. If you think about it, I can put you in a huge vista, a massive epic landscape, but I can say, look at that tiny thing over there within that. So the cliche is, you want someone to look at their face cut to a close-up. But actual fact, it's composition often. It's the shot composition, it's the movement of the shot. I'm still looking at that little thing over there, because you told me that's where the story is. And that's the thing sometimes with theatre I feel frustrated about, because that's the beauty of filmmaking, is not editing and spoon feeding, not saying, you know, I want you to see that he's looking over there to her by cutting to a close-up of him doing that, you know, but that actual fact you can just guide the viewer through image. And that's what we were doing in 1917. I think about, you know, the long time we spent on No Man's Land, which is a sequence in which you're both watching them, but you're also seeing what they're seeing. You're also seeing them small in a big environment and then tight up against them. You know, your eye has a chance to wander when their eye has a chance to wander. You see things that they don't see. You don't see things that they do see. And all those things is shifting constantly. And the control, I think, of where the eye goes in that one long snaking shot, I'm really proud of that. And I think that, you know, you and I mean, I give you a huge amount of credit for that sequence, because you were on that sequence early on. And you said quite rightly, listen, in the trenches, we don't have any choice. We're either in front of them or behind them. So, you know, the first 15 minutes is going to be fucking hard. Where we look is kind of takes care of itself in a way. We're either going to be behind them looking down the trench, or we're going to be in front of them and you see what they're passing through. The moment we go over the parapet and we're in no man's land, we have 1,000 options. So that's when the style of the movie, that's when we have to make our big decisions. And that to me was, I think you'll probably agree with, the most difficult sequence of the film. Because they were in.
Yeah,
I don't mean technically. Technically, the river.
No. It's the key to the whole film, wasn't it? Really, style-wise. Yeah.
And think of how many times the camera shifts. What it's showing you, how sometimes it shows you them, sometimes it shows you what they see, sometimes what they don't see, sometimes what they do. You know, how much information it's giving you the whole time. The crows, the rats, the tank, the mist, the feet in the mud. You know, the slipping, suddenly very close, suddenly distant again. Within maybe 30 seconds of the shot, you go right from behind the heel of George Mackay's boots to 30, 40 yards away, looking low across a fetid pond with dead bodies floating in it, and then way in the distance. Probably 30, 40 seconds separates what is a very tight, almost detailed shot that you would probably do as an insert normally, and a massive epic master shot that shows the whole of this cavernous shell hole with two of them in the mist in the distance and the bodies in the foreground. And that's the same shot. And I feel that that's the sequence of the movie I feel really, really proud of.
So would you consider doing a movie without dialogue? No, I mean, what do you stream?
Have you got an idea, Roger?
Actually, you do,
I have
Roger.
actually.
Yeah.
I mean, the way you're talking now, I think you should give To the White Sea a go.
Well, I read To the White Sea, and To the White Sea. Joel and Ethan's script To the White Sea is pretty fabulous, you know.
Pretty amazing.
It's a great script, and it's astonishing that it's never been, except that it's obviously vastly expensive. Totally. I mean, that's what you're looking for the whole time. But you're almost trying to achieve, you know, the ultimate is, I mean, that's why, you know, 2001 or you know, you're going for these sort of, you know, when film is at its most pure. But it's also, you know, we talked a lot about Tarkovsky when we made 1917, and you know, there's long sections of Tarkovsky movies with nothing, no dialogue, no music. I mean, it's just soundscape, really. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's funny because for me, I came from, first of all, I come from a literary background. You know, my dad is English teacher. My mum is publisher and then an author. So I grew up surrounded by books, still surrounded by books. You know, my way into the movies was through a literary medium, through theatre, which is all, you know, really dialogue based. It's a writer and actor led medium, and into movies, which is a director and an image led medium. And so it's taken me time to have the confidence to rid myself of dialogue. And the most difficult things in 1917 were the periods of silence, and having confidence, and this is for both of us, to say, okay, well, once they leave the orchard and go in at the farmhouse, they're not going to say anything. And us looking and going, well, it's quite a long way, isn't it, with no dialogue? But to trust that the story and the tension in the frame was enough to carry the audience with the boys, which it was in those occasions. I mean, another one would be, I remember fondly, the end of the movie. You know, as we know that in the original script, it was supposed to be sitting on the banks of a stream, But then when we scouted the fields that we were going to put the field station in, the field hospital at the end, we saw that beautiful tree standing alone on the Salisbury Plain, and we sort of looked at it and went, that looks pretty amazing. And did it not seem like a beautiful irony that the movie should start with him alone against a tree and end with him alone against a tree, but everything has changed, and suddenly it all made sense. And then we looked at it and we're like, well, how far should he walk? Did he walk this far? This far? How are you going to judge that? At the end of a 2-hour movie, you have to judge on the day exactly how many steps he takes in silence, right? From where he stands with Blake's brother to the tree. And it varied, didn't it? I was like, that's a bit far, and you were like, it should be much further away. And there speaks the cinematographer's like, you should walk miles, The audience are going to love it. It's fine. It's just that tree should be way off in the distance.
Okay. Let's get to it. Because what do you think of what's in there? Do you think it should still be shorter or longer?
No, I think it's perfect. I never think when he walks, oh, come on,
No.
And I never think
you've earned it, haven't you? You really have earned that.
Exactly. But it was you, Rod, saying that's too close. He's too close. I mean, I moved it 20 yards closer or something. And you said that's not far enough. And so eventually we found that, but that sense of what can the audience take after a movie, after the end of a movie we haven't even fucking made yet, and we can't come out of it. Those are the scary bits. We're like, well, I don't bloody know. It's like, it feels okay, but
there's certain shots could be in any part of the movie. There's certain shots that the audience is going to do it for you. You can just, I think, you can have a shot like that. It's like being in the truck, the guy's looking back at the road going away from them. There's so many films where that's been done, like by Antonioni or Tarkovsky. I know they're kind of, maybe people would call them art house films, but you watch them and just emotionally the shot goes on, but you are creating so much thought, you're considering so much as you're watching that image of the road disappearing or Schofield's walk to the tree. You know what I mean? You're thinking back the whole story. You're thinking about the man. You're thinking about his future. And then it's such a reveal when he takes the picture out at the end. It's a payoff, isn't it, for that long moment?
I mean, I agree. I think, though, that there is a sort of, it depends on the shot. There's something about watching a road receding behind you as you drive away from something that has a kind of tension in it, because you're watching something diminish and get smaller. So you have a sense of journey. And I think that you can hold shots longer when you're moving for that very reason, that you're used to. I mean, I did get slightly pissed off, as you might have noticed, on the road when we were doing a gazillion interviews for the movie, of people saying, well, don't you think that, the one-shot thing is a trick? I'm like, okay, can I just be clear here? Editing is a trick, okay? Editing is the trick. Because guess what? In any movie, when you're going back and forth, there were cameras in the room, but you're making you believe there's no cameras there. That's a much bigger trick. We travel through life in one shot. This is much closer to how we experience life. We don't fucking cut in life. So what's the thing about a trick? Movie making is a giant trick. Just because you're not on set and you don't realize how much trickery is involved in making a movie, don't tell me that this one shot is a trick. If there had been digital cameras in 1920, you think we would be the third people to make a one-shot movie? They'd have made thousands of the fucking things, right? Because they wouldn't have had that. So anyway, that drove me mad on the thing. Like, it's not. This is how we live. So what happens when you go into that shot, following him to the tree at the end, is it's like, that's what it's like. You walk towards something and it gets larger, and you immediately there's a sort of meditative understanding. He's heading to a certain point and we're going to stop when we get there. Therefore, I'm okay to simply wait and let that happen and look at the grass and begin to look at the shift of the light on the land and all that sort of stuff, and begin to read his body language and understand what he's been through. And exactly as you say, go back into the movie and begin to consider. And also, it was very important to me, because you don't have recourse to cutting. What you do rhythmically with cutting all the time is prepare audiences for something, right? It's going to go bang, it's going to go bang, it's going to go bang, bang, like that. The cut tells you something's coming. It's a little pushing on the face, reverse, bang, okay, big explosion. You don't have any of that. So you can't shift rhythms and prep. So what I had to do at the end, and this is obviously very important with Tom's music, is to say to the audience, the end's coming now. We're coming to the end. That tree is going to be the end. You're right. Are you ready for this now? He's sitting down. Are you prepared for the last beat of the movie? Now he's going to do something you didn't expect. He's going to take out some photographs. Now, even the music is saying it completes its phrase as he sits down. It empties out, so you're allowed the space to see something new. And then it rebuilds us so that after he closes his eyes, it doesn't come as a shock when it goes to black. It's building, and black, like that. So the black comes in the rhythm of the music. So all the time, what you're doing is you're actually having to impose rhythm that you would normally do with an edit, but with other means. You're imposing rhythm with music. You're imposing rhythm with composition, because what you're saying is, I'm telling you how long this scene's going to be. I'm telling you where we're headed because you can see it. And so, but I found those are the moments that were the most difficult to judge. I felt like, hey, the big trench run, we could have held that for another 20 seconds. That would have been, but that was weirdly, doesn't take a genius to see that that's going to hold, right? But it is hard. I mean, another one where I had that same thought was going through the woods. So we're going all the way up the bank, the river, right? So you remember, washed up on the river. Anyone listening to this, he's clambered out over the dead bodies. He's going up a bank and through a woods, and eventually he comes across the singing soldier and the whole of the Devons. That's a long sequence. I mean, it's probably taken 3 or 4 minutes to get from the river to the. And there were a couple of moments where we thought, that's quite a long way up that bank. But amazingly, I think you tune into different things. You start listening to the wind in the trees. You start hearing the sound getting closer, and then it drifts away again as the wind takes the singing, and then the camera shifts around, and now you're following him and you hear the sound of his footsteps, and then you see shapes. And are they shapes? I'm not sure they are. And so your thought process is developing the whole time. Now, I don't think if we'd shot it in a conventional way, we would have cut it much shorter than it is. I think it's the length you probably would have cut it. You'd have thought, we can hold this for quite a long time, because we've got all these other things we can play with. Actually, in the end, I don't think it's indulgent of those shots. I don't think those shots are excessively long. But when it is just one, and you have to make the decision on the day, it is quite sobering, isn't it?
Right.
Challenging.
But then you do that in theatre, so you make that decision, don't you? You can't change the speed, the pace of a play once it's been set. You can't. And you also have that feeling that you're judging rhythm without editing all the time as a theatre director. So you're judging always when does an audience. I feel an audience needs a shift of tempo here, because otherwise I can feel them beginning to drift. I think that I spent so long. I mean, I really did spend. I spent so much of my life sitting with audiences. That's the other thing, and getting the feeling from an audience when they're bored, and recognizing the difference between the silence of fascination and the silence of boredom, which are two quite different feelings. But if you were to turn a microphone on, it would sound exactly the same if you're listening on headphones. But in the room, you can feel when an audience goes dead. You can feel it. And the other thing you feel, and I think this becomes second nature to the theatre director, is you always leave the rehearsal room feeling pretty good. I think it's in good shape. I've got a worry about a performance. Maybe I can build that. There's a couple of little things that technically need to be sorted out. But basically, I think it's fine. You go through the whole technical rehearsal, and then you sit in the audience on the first preview. And the moment the lights go down with a real audience there, and the lights come up on this play, you immediately think, oh my God, they're not going to understand that bit, and they're not going to understand it. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't happened yet. But you totally they're not going to get that bit. They're not going to find that funny. And you immediately feel it. And it's like, and then you think the same thought happens to every time. Why didn't I know that last week when I was sitting looking at it?
but the presence, the physical presence of the audience is such a thing. And I tell you what it's like. It's very like when you've worked on a movie in isolation, you might even have had this experience as a couple, right? And you're really pleased with it. And then, so Rod, James hasn't, let's say this is a while since she hasn't been involved in a movie you've been doing, but let's say the last time was, and then you're really excited about it. And then she sits down to watch it. And the moment she starts watching it, you start watching it through her eyes. Yeah. You start thinking, fuck, I'm not sure this works, because you feel her thinking, really? You like this? But you still.
And are those feelings correct? Or is it just nerves?
Oh, that's a very good question. Sometimes it is just nerves. But oftentimes you are, more often than not, you're correct. And you feel like, and my immediate instinct always is, oh, stop. I can sort this out, right? Give me a couple of days and I can make it better. And you have to go through this weird sort of painful, beautiful, painful period where you know that the show isn't ready yet. And audiences have to watch it, knowing that you've still got to make these changes. So it's like, and you want to sort of close it down, do the work and reopen it again. But you have to go through these previews. But that also teaches you stuff too. So you're getting all this invisible feedback from an audience. And it becomes a kind of second nature that, when I was writing 1917, I just felt like, with Christy, I just felt like, I know after the river section, we can hold that singing in the woods, because it will have been the escape from Icus, the jumping off the bridge, the going down the river will be so, if it works as I think it will be so intense. You'll need to breathe and decompress, and you'll need this sort of meditative period where, in a sense, he's coming out of this journey through the underworld back into the land of the living again. And at the end of that, we'll be refreshed, ready for the final movement of the movie, which is fundamentally action until the very end. So without that singing in the woods, if you'd walked off out of the river, walked up the slope and was immediately in the trench, you wouldn't have been able to take that final trench run, because you'd come straight out of the river and you'd be like, stop, enough, I can't take anymore.
Let me get my breath.
Yeah, well, I'm being bombarded, and that feeling of where the rhythm is and how it shifts back and forth, that's a theatrical instinct, I think, that you just know, okay, we need, in order for that last movement to work, there has to be a period of calm and contemplation in some way, where everything stops. And that gave us the space in the movie to have the song. And one thing buys the next, the journey through no man's land and the tension of that buys the journey into the dugout. The escape from the dugout and the tension of the collapsing tunnel buys the long conversation they have all the way down the hill through the orchard, which then buys us, in the nice calm, then buys us the plane crash. And it's just that, the yin and yang of it, the way in which it flows back and forth from energy to contemplation. And, I think one of our favorite scenes in the movie, Roger, which is him in the back of that truck, I think that is bought entirely by the death of Blake. I mean, that scene doesn't work unless you've lived through 10 minutes of your friend dying in your arms. Then you can have a scene where everyone's chatting, but no one's looking at them. They're all looking, in a way, it's a little bit what I was describing about Remains of the Dead.
Yeah, I was thinking of that when you were describing it. Yeah.
You're looking at the guy who's not saying anything, because you know what he's lived through, and they don't. And so, and that, but it had a different set of rules, didn't it, 1917?
That's for sure. So you go back and forth between directing theatrically and in movies, right?
I do, yeah. I mean, I'm slowing down in my old age. I used to do an insane amount of stuff. I mean, I did so many plays, back to back, and in a way, I'm so grateful that I did. I learned an enormous amount, but I would do 4 or 5 plays a year, which, given that each rehearsal period is 2 months from rehearsal to opening, really meant that I often had only a week or 2 between projects, and I would just go and go and go. But I learned so much, and I did plays that I liked, and I found that when I started doing them, I had no aptitude for doing them at all, and I just was doing them because I liked them, and that's not enough. You have to have something you need to say about them, which is different. I mean, particularly in classical theatre, you have to sort of add to the dialogue about the play. You have to have something to add to the debate. And if you don't, you're just going to do a nice production, Othello or something. Someone else can do it. But now, I mean, the last 5 years since Spectre, I've done 2 plays and a movie, which is more my rhythm now. You know, I did The Ferryman in 17, I did Lehman Trilogy in 18, 19, and they both carried on. The Ferryman went to Broadway, Lehman Trilogy went to New York and Broadway in the West End. And 1917, which was, you know, as probably 6 months in the writing and the conceiving, and then a year in the making and the shooting and all that stuff. So, and I find that I enjoy it. I've enjoyed it more, and I've been prouder of the work, and it made me want to write more and conceive things from the ground up. You know, I don't think I'm a great writer. I mean, if I had to write an American Beauty style script, I wouldn't know where to start in terms of balancing storylines and the wit in the dialogue and the skill and the characterization. But I think in terms of shape and structure and rhythm, as we've been talking about, I think that's something I'd love to explore a bit. So the more image-based the movies are, the more I feel confident writing them. Or dialogue-based, the less so.
Well, image-based is more interesting anyway, I think. But
We're biased.
Is there, I just wanted to know, is there more pressure in doing movies than theater, or vice versa? Or is it just the same pressure all?
No, well, there's nothing as pressurized in movies as the first preview of a play. The first preview of a play is really scary, and every time I get there, I think, wow, how many times have I done this? And it's just consistently awful feeling. Judi Dench directed one play for Kenneth Branagh, asked to direct a production of Much Ado About Nothing, and because she'd been a very famous Beatrice in a production of Much Ado About Nothing, she said yes. And after the first preview, I was working with her at the time on something else, and I said, how was it? And she said, it's like giving birth to a blind baby and watching it walk towards the edge of a cliff. She said,
oh my God.
That is a brilliant analogy, because it's like, no, don't go. Because there's nothing, literally it's alive, and you can see it happening in front of you, nothing you can do to stop it. So there is never that feeling in a movie where you've got a chance to do it again. Maybe if you fuck up, it's okay. You know, you can just keep going until you get it right. And the same with cutting, you can change things, and right up to, you know, keep changing and changing and changing, which is, you know, good, but also can be a bad thing. But the overall daily pressure of movies is much greater. You know, the sort of day in, day out, you know, the great line of Kubrick's when they say, you know, what's the most difficult thing about directing movies? And he says, getting out of the car in the morning. That is the greatest thing anyone's ever said about directing movies, because that's what happens. You get to the set, you're like, okay, here we go, you know, and you know that you step out, there's going to be 1,000 questions, and you know, and you have to know what your first shot is. You have to know what your setup's going to be. You know, you just have to make the movie. You can't have a day off and say, let's just experiment a bit today, and let's just play around with some ideas. You know, as I've said before, when you say in the theatre, when you say I don't know in the theatre, in answer to a question, it can be the beginning of a great day's work. You know, what does this scene mean? I don't know. Let's explore.
Yeah.
If you say I don't know on a movie set, then the crew, well you don't know, who the fuck does? What are we going to do? Panic and find another job. You know. So you have to know. You just have to have the answers, and that's obviously on a daily basis is a greater pressure.
We were talking about writing before, and given your literary background in working with scripts, can you talk about, and then starting in writing your own script, talk about kind of the process of honing in a script to where it comes to life on, you know, surely the script isn't done just on that page. Like, you're doing some work to bring those words to life. And then when did you take that step and say, you know, I think I really want to write something on my own? I guess kind of both of those.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of always do a little bit of writing on the movies, because, you know, the process of directing is a process of authoring it. I mean, you have to take it from words on a page and bring it to life. You have to midwife it and birth it, all that sort of stuff. So there's always writing there, and I'm you know, constant. I mean, I'm sure there's a few lines in American Beauty that are mine, and a few lines in, you know, But that's quite different, I think, than the act of actually conceiving something and sitting down and saying that the story I want to tell is a story about two men trying to carry a message on, we're in the middle of World War One. I mean, that comes from nothing. I'm not adapting anything. I'm just, it's just the story I happen to want to tell. So then, weirdly, the process of bringing it to life or imagining it as a series of images when you've conceived it yourself is easier, because you've sat down at the table and the first thing that comes into your head tends to be, you just continue along that line. You're not inheriting someone else's words and having to imagine it, from scratch on top of the words. So having said that, I mean, it's not like I know what the shot is. We probably talk more about 1917, about the actual relationship between the camera and the characters more in 1917 than all the other movies we've done combined, because we had to know every second of it. We couldn't try something out and see if it worked. It had to work. So we had to push everything to this logical extreme until we felt we knew, we've got the solution. So for example, sequence like crossing the canal, Roger and I, we had 5, 6, 7 different versions of that, and we probably got our storyboard artist Jim to draw at least 3 or 4 of them. And it was only right there because we were trying to get him crossing how's he going to cross the bridge, without looking like James Bond, without looking like a superhero, but at the same time, where's the camera going to go? And if the camera has to go there, where's the set go? And how much of the bridge? And can he fall in the water? And because you're authoring the whole thing. I mean, all it says in the script is he crosses the canal. I mean, in one version he dropped in the water, in another version, and we can change any of that. Canal could be empty, it could be no water at all, it could just be mud. The canal could be full, you could swim across, you could do this and that. So you're authoring the whole thing together. Now, we know what we want it to be. We don't want it to be stupid or superhero-y. But the number of versions of that, I mean, there was one where there was still the remains of a bridge, and he swung along underneath it. He swung across on his hands, and then swung up on it. There was another one where he fell, and that conversation was a circular one, because it wasn't just what's going to be most credible, but where would the camera be? Well, that would give us the option for the camera to be here, which would then make it possible for him to do this and for us to see that in frame. So the camera is part of the writing as well, because really what I then go back and rewrite it so that it is the scene that the camera angles we've just discussed can shoot and make it. So it's like, and that happened a lot. I mean, so in a sense, the authoring of the movie is as much to do with where the camera is, and Dennis's design is as much to do with the authoring of the movie as the words on the page, because often I'm just putting a line through it and I'm rewriting it, describing what Dennis has just drawn. That came from Bond as well. I mean, that's one of the nice things about Bond is you have got these big non-verbal sequences where you're just talking about engineering, physics. How's he going to get from the bridge on top of the train, and then how does he get? Is he get in the digger, and what happens? And that's part of the fun of it, is the sort of mechanics of it. And then you feed that back into the script. So I learned a fair amount dealing with special effects, stunts, and visual effects on Bond, and the blending of the three, which is where Bond kind of lives. So, for example, the plane sequence in 1917, I felt confident we could make it work because I'd had a similar experience between, stunts, which is pretty basic, just the boys throwing themselves to the floor, visual effects, which is the plane until it hits the barn, special effects, which is the plane after it hits the barn and the plane burning, and morphing and blending between those three so that it feels like an organic whole. That's the experience of doing Bond that helped me trust the fact that this seemingly impossible shot could work with a mixture of, cunning, good choice of the land, the right lighting, the right opening in the barn, running a drone so we've got the right eye line, all of the things that go on to try and unpick something that's that complicated and make it look, when you actually come to watch the movie, quite simple. And then a beautiful stroke of luck, which Roger will concur here, I think, which is that when we got there, and we chose the site for the barn, and we looked out at the barn. There was a natural drop in the land. And Roger, I think it was Roger, who said, what if the plane went down below the horizon and came back up again? And that's the thing for me that makes the sequence work.
Yes.
You know, because you think, well, the plane's going to crash. And so Schofield starts walking towards where he thinks the plane is going to crash. And suddenly it's coming straight at him. And that's the shock. That moment is the thing that makes it. It isn't just a sort of pale repetition of North by Northwest, but instead it's its own thing. You know, you come from the land and everyone being, you know, part of the same team that are writing the movie as image.
Is there any more pressure from when you write a script, and this being the first one that you wrote, that it's that kind of that thing of, if it's your own work, you feel like people might not like it as much, whereas if you're directing something that somebody else wrote, you have the confidence to go out there and do it, and now you're like, oh wait, is this actually a good scene?
No, because you can't blame anyone else. You know, not that I've ever gone, it's a writer's fault. It doesn't hold any water as a director. That tends not to work very well. Because, you know, it's pretty fair to say that, you know, if it's bad, it's generally the director's fault. But I think, yeah, you feel more exposed. I mean, there were certain stages and I felt much more exposed. And when I sent the script out to people, I felt much more vulnerable. Although you always hope, you know, you always think, you know, I hope he likes it as much as I do. I mean, showing it to Roger or showing it to the early people you show it to, I would think that of someone else's script. But the actors particularly, I was very nervous of having my name on the script. And I was very lucky to have a very good and dogged co-writer who stayed with me throughout, you know, the shoot. And so when the days when I felt like lines weren't quite singing, I could turn around to Christy and say, this doesn't feel right. And we just go back and forth for 10 minutes or 20 minutes and we'd work it out, you know, and I just end up rewriting it myself based on a conversation we had. That was very helpful. So, but yeah, you feel more vulnerable, but at the same time, you also feel more confident because you feel like, I know where this came from and I know exactly what I want it to feel like. And there's no one who can come in and go, yeah, but when I wrote it, that's not what I meant. And there's always that stuff thinking, you know, it's like, no, I know I meant that because that's what you know. So no one's going to ever contradict you. But, you know, at the same time, you don't have that sort of other engine running under the movie the whole time, which is the engine of a writer who's just, you know, who knows what they're doing and is a useful resource. I mean, you know, with American Beauty, which was the best experience the writer I've had, Alan Ball was just there every day and you know, delighting in it and occasionally giving a very good note and changing a line or rewriting a little scene here. And that was a very happy experience. So, you know, I've had it work both ways.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I think it's going to be very interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was really brilliant. And it was really interesting. I learned things I hadn't known.
I really, really enjoyed it. And, it's lovely to see you all.
Great.
Stay safe and everything.
Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.